Chers amis, welcome to London. Alors comme vous le savez, voilà, c'est la Foire du Livre dans quelques jours, puisqu'on va l'inaugurer le 19 février, donc c'est vraiment tout proche. Vous êtes ici à Londres parce que tout simplement, le pays qui est mis à l'honneur est le Royaume-Uni. Pourquoi le Royaume-Uni et pourquoi 2014? Vous le savez tous, parce que c'est le centenaire, bien entendu, du déclenchement de la Première Guerre mondiale et que les Anglais ont payé un très très lourd tribut à cette guerre. Alors, je ne vais pas développer plus en tout cas, simplement je voulais vous remercier d'être là. C'est quand même sympa en tout cas d'avoir fait le trajet avec nous jusqu'ici.
Nous, on essaie d'être au service des professions du livre et de faire en sorte que pendant 5 jours, on fête l'édition et qu'on dise quand même dans le livre, il y a plein de choses qui nous aident, nous, citoyens, à nous nourrir, parce qu'on aime la lecture simplement, parce qu'on aime se raconter des histoires, parce qu'on va chercher de l'information. Enfin, un thème. Hervé, qui est historien, en a un tout petit peu parlé. Donc, histoire avec sa grande H. On a choisi la formule de Pérec parce que lui, il a utilisé cette formule parce qu'il avait perdu ses parents, évidemment, pendant le conflit de 40. Mais c'était l'occasion, effectivement, à la fois d'aborder l'actualité éditoriale qui va effectivement beaucoup publier de livres, essais, BD sur 14-18, mais l'histoire avec sa grande H, c'est parce que on est en 2014 20 ans après le conflit rwandais, on va aborder la question. On a le plaisir de recevoir à la fois un belgo-anglais, Patrick McGuinness, qui a fait un livre sur les derniers jours de Ceausescu, et Lola Lafont, son très beau roman, qui, elle, parle aussi des derniers jours de Ceausescu, mais on a aussi voulu mettre un accent tout à fait important sur la traduction. Donc chaque jour, il y aura un débat sur le sujet, et puis il y a toute une série d'autres activités, comme, encore là c'est parce qu'on est fan à mort dans l'équipe, une nocturne. Un petit peu, ça va de The Walking Dead à Frédéric Lenoir. Donc on va se couper en 2. Et même en 3 parce que John King, que vous connaissez peut-être, qui est un auteur qui vient maintenant dans le catalogue de Au diable vos vers, et bien il est là. Donc voilà, je trouve que c'est ça aussi l'identité de la Foire du Livre, c'est qu'il y en a pour tous les goûts. C'est la richesse de ces 5 jours de foire, c'est qu'on est là dans un grand espace d'échange, on va en prendre plein les oreilles, on espère faire plein d'échanges, et que on aura après la Foire du Livre, dans la solitude, comme on veut, le plaisir qu'on a à lire, est-ce que c'est en commun, on le voit avec quelqu'un ou tout seul. Là, la Foire du Livre, on assume ce nom de foire.
Avec la conversion.
Nécessaire de serrer le main de tout le monde.
Where does this passion for history comes from? Because the main theme of Foire du Livre de Bruxelles is about history with its big axe.
Well, I started out as a writer, writing spy stories, thrillers, because that's what I liked to read as a young man in my 20s. I loved to read thrillers. So I started reading books about secret intelligence in wartime, looking for situations where a spy could make a difference in, say, a battle. Typically, for example, the D-Day, what we call the Normandy invasion, what we call D-Day, there were lots of secret plans. And I thought about what would happen if spies discovered the secret plans. So now you see the difference. You can have a story in which a spy gets into danger and you're worried, will he survive, will he be okay? But it's much better to have a story in which the survival of the spy isn't just about him. It's not just about whether he or she is going to be okay. It's about who will win the war. And that makes the thriller much more exciting. So that's why I started to read. I started reading history books about the Second World War to think, how could I put a spy into this situation? and where could I find a battle which was changed by the work of the spy. So that's how it started. It started with looking for something great that a spy could do in a story. Well, the decision I made was to write a trilogy about the 20th century, and Fall of Giants is the first book in the trilogy. And thinking about this, I was thinking about the great dramas of the 20th century and how I would make these dramas into novels. And it just struck me that in the 20th century there were three great wars. There was the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. And that was a very neat way of dividing up the century. I realized that to write one novel about trying to tell the whole story of the 20th century was not good enough. It needed to be more novels than one. And then it struck me that was a good way to divide it up. The three wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. And so that's the reason I wrote about the First World War. It was the first great drama of the 20th century. And it was the worst war ever until that point. And it's also, it lives in people's memories. First World War lives in people's memories. People know things. They know about life in the trenches. And they know about men who charged towards machine guns and were mown down. People know about that stuff, and so it resonates with them. And the other thing about the First World War that attracted me is that we know these things and we don't understand them. And I was attracted to the idea of writing a story that would explain to people what, for example, the Battle of the Somme. Why did the French and British generals send those men to be slaughtered in the Battle of the Somme? What were they thinking about? And if you read that chapter in Fall of Giants, you'll see what their strategy was, and you'll understand why they did that. Before the First World War, most of the countries in the world were not democracies. Most countries were monarchies with a very strong priesthood and ruled by a king or an emperor or a czar. And there were really only three democracies. Only three major countries were democracies in 1914: France, Britain, and the United States. And even they weren't very democratic. For example, women could not vote in any of those countries. But they were sort of, the parliament was sovereign. And the rest of the world, it wasn't. There were parliaments, but they were weak. Parliaments in Austria and Hungary and Germany, for example, but they were weak parliaments. And the First World War destroyed some of the great empires that existed in 1914. It destroyed the Austrian Empire, which was one of the greatest European empires. For hundreds of years, the Austrian Empire had been hugely powerful. And it was run by an emperor and a very powerful priesthood. The Ottoman Empire was destroyed, and the Empire of the Tsars was destroyed. So the First World War was the beginning of that process. Now, if we look around the world, of course there are many countries that are not free, but there are a lot more free and prosperous and democratic countries than there were 100 years ago. So 1914 was the beginning of that process which isn't finished yet, but it was a kind of explosive beginning of that.
Talking back of the writing process, is it something easy for you, or is it something harder with the years?
I mean, it's easy. Anybody can write a novel. It's easy to write a novel. And millions of people do, and write it and throw it away because nobody else wants to read it. The hard part is writing something that somebody else will want to read, and when they've read it and they put it down, the next thing they do is they'll phone their friends and say, "I just read this great book, you've got to read it." That's what I want them to do. That's how we sell books. People telling their friends, "I just read this great book, you've got to read it." And to write something that has that effect is very difficult, and it certainly takes everything I've got. But those criticisms in newspapers and magazines and on television and radio, they're not as important, they're nowhere near as important as what people say to their friends. Those are the real critics are the people who actually went to the store or they went online at Amazon and they actually paid money for the book. And they're the important critics. And if they say his new book's not very good, then I'm in real trouble. If you say his new book's not very good, it maybe doesn't matter so much. But if those people say it's not very good, then I'm in trouble.